the reason that I am choosing to go wider rather than just staying the course with one and staying in that business from a growth perspective is that I think it's much, much, much easier. And I'm not saying it's easy, but much, much, much easier to go from 0 to $1 million in EBITDA per year than to go from 1 to 3. I'd rather get one business to $1 million in EBITDA, and then rather than trying to keep growing, just try to make that revenue as durable as possible, and then go start the next one.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Small Business Black Holes, the podcast that shines a light on the hidden challenges of scaling a business. Hosted by Alan Pence, each episode explores the critical shifts entrepreneurs make as they grow beyond $1 million, $5 million, even $30 million, and move from brute force to sustainable professional growth. Stay with us as we uncover what it really takes to escape the black holes of business and scale with intention.
All right, we are back with Small Business Black Holes, and we have a perfect guest today. This is going to be rock star kind of episode here because we are grooving about the same issues. Eli Ruble, who is with CEO and founder of Profit Labs and several other agencies. Welcome to the podcast, Eli.
Thanks, Alan. I'm excited to be here in the black hole with you.
That's all right. So tell us about your 3 agencies now and kind of give us the history and where they are.
Absolutely. So I cut my teeth in software. I was founded a software company that I built and sold in 2014. And then I ended up acquiring an e-commerce business and thinking that that was going to be the field that I would go into. Pretty quickly realized that e-commerce wasn't for me. I sold that off to a private equity firm in 2019. And then in 2019, I decided that it was time for me to shift from grinding and just sprinting as hard as I could to a more balanced lifestyle. I wanted to start a family and it came up with a term I called the tricycle life, which was this vision of being able to push my kid down the street, tree line street, middle of the week, middle of the day, and not have any work getting in the way or any kind of worries there. And so I realized that starting a services business or an agency was likely the clearest path for me to get to that vision as quickly as I wanted to. So I started my marketing agency, MatterMade, in 2019, and started my design agency, No Boring Design, in 2023. And then I just handed both of those businesses off to a general manager and a leadership team. And I'm starting my 3rd agency, Profit Labs. We actually just launched this past week.
Awesome. So give us an idea. So the first one was what kind of marketing matters?
So MatterMade, we do performance marketing for B2B SaaS tech companies. So our sweet spot was, emerging tech, call it, just raised a VC round and we're, growing quickly type of a company. We worked with companies like Dropbox, Loom, Calm, Hopin, Yelp, a bunch of others, helping them with their paid media.
Yeah. And so was that like a lot of social media advertising, Google advertising, all that, or?
Exactly. Yeah. All of it.
Okay. Interesting. So I want to double click on that in a minute because I want to hear how you think that's changing. And then the second one was design. So like branding and websites and stuff like that.
Precisely. Yeah. Branding, websites, and marketing collateral. A lot of the companies that we worked with on the performance media side of the house weren't able to ship the design assets that they needed quickly enough for campaigns. So their internal designers would be focused on product initiatives or other things. And so I saw this need in the market to have an ad hoc design team that could just sprint really quickly and create high quality assets on a timeline.
That's cool. So then how big did these get before you were able to kind of move on?
Yeah. So MatterMade grew to 4.2 million in EBITDA at our peak in 2021. And No Boring Design, my newer agency, we're on track to do $1 million in EBITDA this year. So yeah, that's where those two were. The MatterMade was around like 40 people at our peak headcount. No Boring Design today is around 30 people.
Wow. So 40 people doing 4.2 million in EBITDA. That's like some kind of freaking dream. How is that possible?
I wonder, I'm like, sometimes I wonder if I was a little bit too lean with the thing, but I know one of the things that I think my business community here in Denver knows me for is I'm really, really aggressive about optimizing our profit margins, which sounds like, oh, duh, of course, any business owner wants to be aggressive about that. But I'd say like that's my skill set is um, just having a maniacal focus on the inflows and the outflows and how we can be as efficient as possible to service the revenue, and trying to productize our service internally as much as possible so that it's not all custom and bespoke and requiring as many hours as that type of work can require.
Give me the scoop. How do you do it? Like, give me a couple of steps here.
Yeah, so yeah, it's funny. The new agency I'm starting basically stems out of this. It's called Profit Labs, and we help agency owners, 7 and 8 figure agency owners who might not have the level of clarity or transparency that they want around their financial and operational metrics in order to make the most profitable decisions for their business. Because what I found in scaling those other two agencies um, was that it was really having like I needed to have that data, that insight first in order to make the right decision in the first place at all these junctures that we face as agency owners. And so an example of that would be, one of the big examples of that would be, load balancing labor, right? I think a lot of us agency owners out there have experienced that pit in the feeling stomach where, suddenly you close more deals than you're expecting to close for the month or for the quarter, and you're wildly understaffed, or vice versa. Maybe you lost a couple of clients and you're wildly overstaffed and bleeding cash. And I certainly started off flying blind, and over time we built a kind of a system and a method for staying on top of that, where we take our team's time tracking data and we merge that with operational data from our CRM. So we know, okay, we have 10 deals that are sitting in our final deal stage in our CRM. And we know that we close deals from that deal stage into closed one at an 80% close rate. And so from there, we can estimate pretty accurately what within 30, and we have 30-day sales cycle. So we can estimate the amount of revenue that we're likely to bring in within the next 30 days, compare that with our current utilization and capacity as a team, and then forecast from there exactly what headcount we require in order to maintain a healthy staffing level for this future demand. Um, and I think that's just something that most earlier stage agency founders aren't doing for themselves unless they're in like a retro.
So I'm saying if you're gonna get people to a you like 70% profit margin, I would say everyone in this, whoever hears this, should immediately pick up the phone or email and call or email you to figure out how to like take you into that service immediately, because that is just incredible, right? So we're talking 40 people. I'm thinking 6-7 million in revenue,
That
probably.
sounds pretty bang
It,
on. Yeah.
like I thought you were going to tell me, hey, I've got 10, onshore people making 150K, and then we just like found this treasure trove of people in Argentina or wherever it was while the peso was collapsing, and we were paying them 15 cents an hour, and there were 150 of them, right? But this is 40 people, domestically based, sounds like, and doing that kind of margin, that feels like even load utilization that would get you somewhere, but it's
Yeah.
got to be that productization, right? I mean, that's
Totally. Yeah. I mean, when you say that, I wish I had discovered nearshore talent back when I was at that point with MatterMade. I hadn't yet developed the muscle of trusting nearshore talent, which now I'm all about it. Like my design agency is 99% nearshore talent, as opposed to the opposite with MatterMade is almost 100% US based talent. And now I have it as this like superpower that I wish I had discovered earlier to control margin. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, it was all about productization and figuring out, we used we use a pod model, and we tried all sorts of different configurations of like, what's the most efficient and effective delivery team, and how can we pare that down to the bare essentials where the client is still getting, the value that we pitch them in our brand profit promise, but we're not requiring a bunch of heads and a bunch of cross-departmental collaboration in order to deliver the service, which is where you obviously lose a ton of efficiency otherwise.
Yeah, and pod being you have someone from each part of the service cycle working on one set of clients together as a team versus passing between departments, right? Gotcha. And was it like, hey, we can build a YouTube ad fat or whatever it is, right? You LinkedIn, we've done this 30 times, 100 times. So now we've got it down to like, you can like take something off the shelf and tweak it and then it's done kind of thing.
Yeah, it was, it was an interesting time when we launched that company. We caught this wave with my network having started a SaaS company before. I was able to get us in with some clients that became, multi-billion-dollar companies. And so, like Loom as an example, I think a lot of people now have come across Loom and used it, or Dropbox, another example. Like we literally built Loom's demand program from scratch. They had one marketer on staff when they brought us in, and their CEO, Joe, was like, Eli, I need you to create the program, create the strategy, tell me what roles I should be hiring so that eventually we can backfill you. And so, yeah, we had the opportunity to work on some really cool projects.
For like how to grow Loom's entire business.
The demand side of their business. So where are they bringing in their leads and opportunities, sourcing revenue for them?
That's pretty intense. And then, so take me to the design business. Does that have similar type margins, or has that changed?
Yeah, so I had a realization, which is kind of counterintuitive, but I think it makes sense to me now, and at the time it didn't make sense. So MatterMade was operating on something like the year that we did 4.2, I think we were at 67% net margins that year. And I brought in a buddy of mine who he's started and sold many companies. He's probably 20 years my senior. And we were experiencing some crazy growing pains. It felt like we were this rocket that was starting to fall apart as we were, trying to leave the orbit. And so I brought him in just to take a look at the business and help me figure out what was going on. And this must have been year 3 of that business. And so he meets with the leadership team, he goes through all of our docs, he looks through our models and our forecasts, and spends probably about a month with us, just kind of really digging in. And at the end of it, he goes, "You're too profitable." And I thought he was being funny. Like, we're really close friends. I thought he was just jabbing me and being like, "Yeah, you got a great business. Stop complaining." But he was totally serious. And I realized he was absolutely right, which was I was running the business so efficiently that I was actually choking the business. I wasn't investing in the layers that the business at that stage was starting to require, and that I wasn't really used to needing, where, it's, hey, we need to add new layers of management, and it can't just be the same structure that worked well for us when we were 15 people. Like, it just doesn't work at that size. And so I came to develop this rule where now my sweet spot for net margin is between 45% and 55%. And if we get close to 55%, I'm like aggressively looking for ways within the business to spend that money to make the revenue more durable.
How generous of you to get all the way down to 45%. I mean, so I mean, you're preaching my, I would probably have said, I agree with him, right? You're like, that's just too profitable. You're going to be burning everything out. Obviously you did some amazing stuff there. And even, to get to 45 to 55%, with 55, I would still maybe say the same thing, but you're preaching my book here, talking about, hey, like at 15, you're obviously really good at growing stuff, right? So often the owner is really good at growing stuff. They grow it really quickly, and then the operational part starts falling apart or they start bouncing back and forth, right? And they turn off growth while they fix operations, and then back and forth. And so it's all about my sense, and I'd be curious what you guys did, because usually what I see works is that the owner stays focused on growth while they hire better operational talent to help grow the company. So I'd be curious how you found it.
I honestly think that that's totally right. And it's something that I haven't done well, and I'm only now really realizing. that's kind of my new model for this agency that I'm launching, Profit Labs, to help other agencies be more profitable and increase their margins. My whole plan there is to install someone who has been in that industry as an executive for the past 10 years in my place at the operational level within the first 12 months of the business, because I just kind of, I can see it as, sure, I could stay attached to it for the first 3 years, grow, and then make that move. But why give myself that headache if my strength is, I've created the systems and the frameworks and the tools in order to deliver the offering, but I can train someone else on that. So it's realizing that I'm not the right person.
So one of the things that I've been sort of preaching, so I'd be curious because I think I know the answer to this, but when a company's like 2, 3, 4 million, normal company, right? They're probably doing 20%
Yeah.
bottom line.
Yeah.
If they're a decent service business, right? So I always say, look, there's just not enough money here for you to have a full leadership team and a real leader. I mean, there's some equity stuff you can do, but it feels like that's too early for owners to just give it keys to a GM and walk away. So what do you think has changed that for you? Talking about handing over $2-3 million businesses.
Yeah. So I have a leadership team that sits on top of the orgs, so when I started building the design agency, No Boring Design, the leadership team that formed there just ended up becoming the best leadership team I've ever worked with. And so as I saw that unfolding, I was like, I don't want to have to rebuild a leadership team like this every single time. What if I could take this leadership team and have them sit on top of all of the orgs and then hire line leaders, almost like a line of business, even though the entities are totally separate. But our head of sales sits at this universal leadership table, but then she can hire a director of sales within each of the business units. And then they can hire AEs underneath them. So that's kind of what's allowed me to cheat in a way and get the strengths of a leadership team on board and in the DNA of the company earlier on than we could otherwise normally afford, because we're splitting the cost of that leadership team between 3 entities, which is.
Yeah. So I think that was one of the things I was thinking you were probably doing. And then I would wager that having that level of profitability, you have a lot more room to compensate a high level CEO, right? So, when you're doing 2 to 400K in EBITDA, there's not a lot of money to divide up. But when you're doing 4,
Yeah.
there's a function there of just a high profitability.
Totally.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so let's talk about the new business. Well, a couple of things. One is, where do you see? So I've seen this a couple of times with agency owners, right? So there's and I just interviewed a guy a couple of weeks ago about this. There seems to be this tendency to create new agencies rather than stick in one and really grow it. So is this because marketing is uniquely, you need like focus, or is it some growth issue with agencies themselves?
My kind of personal take on this, the reason that I am choosing to go wider rather than just staying the course with one and staying in that business, from a growth perspective, is that I think it's much, much, much easier. And I'm not saying it's easy, but much, much, much easier to go from 0 to $1 million in EBITDA per year than to go from 1 to 3 to more than 3. Like that next step and those next phases of growth just require, like, the business has to transform so many times along that path, as I'm sure you've experienced yourself. I would just rather I'd rather get one business to $1 million in EBITDA, and then rather than trying to keep growing, just try to make that revenue as durable as possible, and then go start the next one and stack the profit in that way. But I don't think there's a right or wrong way. That's just kind of the game I'm playing.
So it's not hiring that next level of management and going after the next level of account
Yep.
and go, is that sort of what the barrier is? Or it's the more difficult hurdle?
I think it's that. I think it's your the level of I'm not even gonna try that word. The layers of management, adding that in, you end up with the team members who are amazing earlier on, but they aren't the right team members now for the business as it is in its current state type of a thing. And, just that creates headaches and it creates more it creates the type of problems that are just draining to me personally. A great CEO or GM would obviously thrive in that environment. But for me, I like the creative process of going 0 to 1 a lot more. Um, and I also think at that stage, when you start to push out past the 3 million in EBITDA, you're really thinking about like, how do I own more of this category and have a real brand as opposed to, I mean, you can get to 1 million in EBITDA just, and again, it's not meant to be derogatory, but like picking up scraps essentially. Like there's just enough business to go around in most categories. Yeah, exactly. Hustling. Thank you. That's a really much better way to say it. Like through pure hustle, you can find opportunities and get to 1 million in profit, no problem. But then I don't think you can do that same thing to get to 3 plus.
Yeah. So it's exactly what the other guy said. That's pretty funny. So because this is really like challenging my thought process, because I've talked a lot about getting through those barriers and how difficult it is. And I think it's 100% correct that it is very difficult. And I think as long as you're focused on cash flow, it makes a lot of sense what you're doing. I guess the downside would be sale, right? Because you don't get, unless you can say this entity somehow makes these separate entities somehow make a greater whole somehow. Most people are going to look at it as a bunch of little revenue streams and not like that, right? But if you're running it for cash flow, who cares, right?
Yeah, and I think to your point, like there are some portfolio models that I've seen people rolling that are super way smarter than what I'm doing, where they're saying, okay, I'm going to create a bunch of separate small companies, but we're going to service the same ICP, and so they can easily make the case that yeah, we have 5 or 6 independent agencies that are all at 1 million in EBITDA, but rather than trading it at 2 to 3x multiple on 1 million in EBITDA, we should actually trade at like an 8 to 10x multiple on 6 million in EBITDA because we can just bring these all together into one agency. We sell to the same person. I think that then you can get into that story that you were alluding to a second ago. But for me, I'm playing a cash flow game. I want to kind of build and hold.
So tell me about, what does it take to do the zero? Like, take me through the process of going 0 to 1 million. Like, you talk a lot about your ICP. So like, what are the factors that this process you go through?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fun question because I'm in the thick of it right now, launching my newest agency. Um, and so I think, I mean, the first and foremost, it's all about like, am I selling into a budget that already exists? I think there's a tendency for people to get a little too creative sometimes, and they start selling something that's a net new expense for their ICP, for their buyer. And that can be a murky place to be because people like it. They like what they're hearing. It makes sense. Like, oh, I should be doing this. But it's not like they can take budget that they already had allocated to one thing and just move it over to that without some serious, push and pull internally. And so I like to be selling into a line item and budget that's already well established. Another filter criteria that I have now is I like to be selling into a line item of budget that is really, really durable, regardless of what's happening external to the company. And that insight comes from my own pain with my first 2 agencies, because marketing and design are very much seen as nice to haves if the market turns sour. Whereas finance and like this new Profit Labs, this new business that helps 7 and 8 figure agency owners improve their profit margins, like you don't fire your finance team unless the business is like filing chapter 11. They go down with the ship if the ship goes down, kind of a thing. And so I like the durability element to that. So that's another important filter criteria, because it means that you won't struggle as much with churn as a business where like with design as a good example, we can knock it out of the park with our design. The client could be super over the moon happy, but then, their board says, hey, actually, we need you to restrict spending a little bit going in this new quarter or whatever it is. And boom, design is suddenly nice to have and your agency gets fired. So churn is, I think, like thinking about who your customer is, what your offering is, where in their P&L you're selling that budget, and how durable you are within that P&L is a pretty big lever for how quickly you can get to $1 million.
Interesting. Okay, so how are you thinking? So I would assume like at Market, was it Market Matter? Sorry, I'm really terrible at that. MatterMade. You are and were selling to high growth startups. I assume the monthly, retainer or whatever it is pretty high. Going into working with smaller agencies, you're going to be, at a different kind of price point, I assume, right? So how did you think about that? Like, because I think most agency owners go after, hey, I want a big retainer kind of thing, right? I want more is better.
Yeah, I mean, there are pros and cons to that, right? Because you're absolutely on it. MatterMade, when I first launched MatterMade, our price point was $3,500 a month. Within 3 years, our price point was $45,000 a month, and our biggest customer was paying us $200,000 a month, which was amazing. Especially because there's this weird thing that we experienced. I'm curious if this was something you've experienced, where once the customer got to a certain size, it almost was like the client got easier to deal with, because there were so many people on their team that were involved that there was like bureaucracy that would naturally slow the pace of work down on their end. And so we would, with the smaller companies, with the startups and the, just growing really quickly companies, they're all about speed and pace and velocity. And we're having to set that tone for them. So in a way, the bigger customers you can actually be so much more profitable with, just because of that internal bureaucracy on their end. But that comes at the cost of, a new CMO gets hired. What's the first thing that CMO does after, letting the dust settle? More than likely than not, they're going to bring in their favorite A team that they had at the last company that they were super successful with, and rip and replace any relationships that aren't familiar to them, because like it's too big of a risk for them to take that chance. And so you run that risk of suddenly having a huge swath of your revenue or some meaningful percentage disappear. You also run the risk in acquisition of revenue concentration, right? Of the buyer looking at it and saying, hey, you actually, 15% of your revenue or 20% of your revenue is coming from one client. We're going to have to discount that profit, that revenue out of your multiple. So I actually have come to really like the smaller price point, because I find that then you get into a game of just how can we make the stickiest product possible. It's not the type of thing that stands out like a sore thumb on their P&L when they're reviewing their expenses every month. This new agency I'm launching, our starting price point's $2,900 a month, right? So it's like, for the value that we're delivering, I don't think folks are going to really bat an eye at that if they're already over $1 million in revenue. And then you can only build on it from there, right? And so I think that's another piece, going back to your original question on how do you get to that $1 million, or what are the things that I think through. I think a lot about what are the levers, or what's the journey that you can create and the levers you can pull in getting someone to move through your pricing structure. So I'm a big fan of the entry-level price is premium enough to get close to the margins you want. The middle price is the actual tier you want everyone on, and you make the jump from the entry price to the middle price small enough that it just feels like a no-brainer. It's like, if you're already spending $2,900 with a vendor, and then the next jump up is another $500, like, and the value is there, like, of course you're not going to cheap out on $500 at that point. So I think a lot about those journeys and how we can move our average selling price up, because that helps you get there so much faster.
That's a very SaaS way of looking at it, right? And then, so tell us what are so you said financial stuff. So what's the scope of services that you're doing in the new agency?
Yeah. So I'm essentially building what I wish I had always had with my first two agencies. With my first two agencies, if you think about the type of bookkeeping, accounting, maybe fractional CFO, when you go out and look for those services as an agency owner, pretty much 99% of the time, you're going to work with a generic SMB provider. So they're going to be doing your financial, oversight and books and whatever. They're also going to be doing the bakery down the street and the coffee shop down the street and the fill in the blank travel company, whatever it is. So you end up with someone who is great at traditional gap accounting and numbers and has no clue about the pain points that your business is experiencing and what you should actually be looking at within those numbers relative to an agency. And so our scope of service, essentially, we take over as plug in as your external finance team, everything from bookkeeping, accounting, fractional CFO. But we bring this proactive lens where we come in and we set up these dashboards. We call them the Profit Command Center, where, like we started off this conversation, we're talking about the idea of load balancing labor and visualizing, what's our capacity look like? What's our utilization look like? And what's that look like once you factor in our sales pipeline and what's likely to close within the next 30 days? Are we going to suddenly find ourselves wildly overstaffed or wildly understaffed? Usually agency owners will just kind of find themselves in those situations and all of a sudden they have a hair on fire problem. They're either bleeding cash and need to let some people go, and then it becomes this emotional decision and it's hard, or vice versa. They're understaffed. Now they're rushing to hire people, which leads to not the best hiring decisions. So our whole vision is to surface those insights before they become a problem within the business and to counsel from a financial lens these agency owners and their leadership teams on what they can be looking for, what they can be doing about it, and ultimately with the mission of helping them increase their profit margins at the end of the day.
So you're really plugged into the marketing and sales process to some. You're consuming at least the information from the sales process.
Yeah, so it's a confluence of financial data, operational data, and team data. So operational data, I would say you're right. Sales data. We don't go as high in the funnel as marketing, but it's really bottom of funnel sales, financial data, and then team data around time tracking, because that's how we get to the utilization and capacity insights.
Right. So you're in there, whatever. I don't know what are people using? We have to use all these government things, but what do you see people using for their time these days? Like their ERP? Well, it's not an ERP at that point, I guess, but are they using like QuickBooks, or are they?
Yeah, for the general ledger, it's usually QuickBooks or Xero. For time tracking, it's usually Harvest or Toggle.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, just curious about that. And then, so then for you, thinking about building this, like, how do you think about building your funnel for attracting clients?
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I share some uh, point of view here.
Trying to get free advice here, Eli.
Yeah. Um, I'm fully bought in on this idea that, especially, and it's not so relevant for agencies, but as AI becomes more and more prevalent, I think people will ultimately decide to buy from you based on your brand or your company's brand and how much they trust you. And so for me, it's all about audience building and sharing the insights and the lessons that I've learned so far in my career. Obviously, I've got plenty to go until I'm at your level, but I have learned some things, and there's some things that I wish I could tell my earlier self. And so I see it as my mission right now to share as much of that freely as possible to attract that trust and those folks who come to rely on me for, hey, if I want people to think of me as the agency profitability guy at the end of the day. Like if I need to learn about agency profitability, Eli's the person that I follow. And then once I start following, I realize, wow, I should be using, Profit Labs to help me increase my profit margins. I'm already paying for a bookkeeper and maybe some fractional CFO support. So like in many cases, it's not even increasing their budget. It's just earning the trust and opportunity to transition that budget over to my firm.
So does that lend you to like, hey, I'm a LinkedIn guy or something like that? Or how do you think about that?
Yeah, so I'm super deep on LinkedIn. I have a whole team of people who help run my account where um, they interview me every month for an hour. We just talk through topics and record in Riverside like we are right now. And then that way they can break all that apart. My strength is not being a content manager or writing even. And so they take my words, break them apart, turn them into posts. We collaborate on that. So it's still my words and still my thoughts, but just someone else is doing the labor there, which is great. Um, Allows us to publish every single day. And then I spend time engaging in the comments and DMing people, that sort of a thing. I spend a lot of time guesting on podcasts where folks are focused on talking to an audience of agency and service businesses. Um, so I'd say that's like on the trust building and audience building side of the house. And then everything else we do, I would say, is pretty traditional. I'm a big believer still in cold email. It's gotten a lot harder over the last couple of years, but it still totally works. So that's an always on channel for us that we're experimenting with constantly. I have a newsletter where we go deep on all things agency profitability. And so that's another kind of channel where I can communicate with an audience. What else? I like partnering with influencers a lot. I think that's like a huge growth hack that so many people ignore for whatever reason. Um, and so just finding people who are super influential with your ICP, with your audience, and finding value that you can bring to them without asking for anything in return, and then building that relationship and ultimately finding ways to, you know, partner on content or, do something that gets them mentioning you, talking about you with their audience.
So it's more like you're sharing audience with them or doing something, and then, but it's not like a you're not like co-marketing or like giving them a cut of something that comes through their show or something like that. Or,
Not like, yeah, exactly. So it not that. It's I'll give you an example. So with my design agency, we one of the maybe most influential people in B2B SaaS marketing is this guy named Dave Gerhardt. And he runs a community of something like 3,000 corporate SaaS marketers who pay to be part of his community. And he hosts an event and all this stuff. And so I essentially went to him and I was like, hey man, your brand sucks. Your website's awful. Let me have my team redo it for you. And originally he's like, no, I'm good, man. I'm good. And at the very end of this call, he goes, actually, I've always wanted a mascot. Could you come up with a mascot for me? And I was like, absolutely. So I go back to my design team and I'm like, we're going to do a full rebrand without his permission. He asked for a mascot. Let's make sure the rebrand has a mascot in it. And we're going to show it to him. And sure enough, we put it in front of him. We get like 2 slides into the presentation and he goes, I want this right now. What do we need to do so I can have this right now? And then, lo and behold, we closed easily $1 million worth of business from that one relationship and everything that led out of that.
so they like helped feature you in the community or something like that. Yeah.
Yep. Mentioned us in newsletters, invited us on their podcasts. Then when he launched his new brand, he mentioned us. Honestly, it's probably closer to 2 million in revenue that we brought in from that partnership.
Wow. Now that is what I call hustle right there. That is awesome.
Yeah. It's fun.
And then what do you think like owners should be thinking about spending on marketing? Like I know people use rules of thumb, like percentages of revenue and, things like that. Where do you think they should be? Or is there no answer to that?
I think it's so vertical specific, like what your market responds to, because I've always been in spaces where throwing money at the problem isn't going to get us greater reach. And it was more about just kind of surgically implementing the spend of capital rather than, like I don't think I've ever spent more than $15,000 a month with my other 2 businesses on marketing, because any more than that was just kind of becoming inefficient and was not really moving mountains. Whereas everything up to that 15K, super valuable. And I think even between my marketing agency, my design agency, that number's different. My marketing agency is maybe $5,000 a month is the most I've ever been able to spend. So it's just, I think it's a very specific and personal answer, even though I know there are some, industry guidelines there. I don't know. What do you think?
So you should be spending at least 5, but once you get over 15, you probably have some inefficiency. That's a good range. I like it. That's great. Well, excellent. Well, if people want to reach out and hire you so that they can become 55% net margin businesses, where should they go?
Well, they can go to profit-labs.co and find us there. They can also find me on LinkedIn. If you just search Eli Ruble or Eli Profit Labs, I'm surely pop up somewhere in there. And shoot me a DM. I'm happy to connect, happy to learn more about your business. And hey, I appreciate you having me on this podcast, Alan.
Yeah, of course, man. It's been a pleasure. I learned a ton from you. So it's super fun. And hopefully maybe we'll have you on again. We'll check in and see how Profit Labs is going.
I'll have to give you the update. You'll have to grill me on our profitability.
That's right, exactly. All right, see ya.
You've been listening to the Small Business Black Holes podcast with Alan Pence. For more insights on mastering the new game, follow @apent, that's APENTZ on X, and make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, in today's world, you don't follow the rules, you write them.